You are going to use a couple here, but I'm going to use everything else. He went back and forth, and still working there, and elsewhere.
Good morning. Welcome to Wild Winter Wednesdays. Yesterday I did Grapevine at KROS, and that's pretty nerve-wracking for me. But we are delighted to see you this morning. As I said at Grapevine, we divide our programs into 4 main themes, and the 4th one is adventures. Well, that's today, Tombstone Adventures. Pam in the back, in the green jacket, will do the next adventures 4 weeks from today, when she tells you about how she bicycled from Washington to Maine. That's a real adventure. But next week, we're going to travel again, when Erica Hansen tells us about her lifetime of travel. So. She's a Clintonian that I heard this morning fell in her driveway. Didn't break anything, but it's tough for us, isn't it, as we age? Well, I need to introduce Mike Kearney, and I said to him when he came in today, what do you want the people to know about you, Mike? And one thing was that his ancestors appeared in this area in 1841. Now, Fulton was founded in 1835. And in fact, he mentioned that he knows stories about one of the first ferry boat owners in Fulton. I happen to live near a building that has a reputation for being where you bought your ferry ticket to cross the river here in Fulton, go from Fulton to Lyons. And I'm wringing my hands because the people who own the building are talking about tearing it down. Anyway, what else do you want to know about Mike? Yes, he's a Clinton native. Born, graduated Clinton High School. And is spending his mature years back in Clinton. I know he has a long history of historic preservation in his blood. He's just finished a couple of terms as a Clinton councilman. And this is one of many of his passions, tombstones. So, Mike Kearney will tell you today about his tombstone adventures. Mike?
Thank you very much. Actually, my great-great-grandparents arrived in Clinton County in 1840. Small difference, but they were early settlers here, and the family has stayed here ever since. Now, the first question that a lot of people would ask is, why photograph tombstones? And then, why try and photograph every single one? My goal for the moment, whoops.
Oops, I know, it's going crazy on me here.
That's okay, as long as you, there we go.
There we go, sorry.
Yeah, we're back to the start.
Jumped on me.
This is the first time I've ever done a presentation with a PowerPoint to begin with, so, we've had no end of difficulty. I prepared the original PowerPoint on my Apple, and then came over here with the presentation on a jump stick, a jump drive, and the computer here was a Windows computer, and it didn't work very well, and so we had several back and forth visits, and I hope that this time it'll go smoothly. Anyway, in my case, nothing starts simply, I suppose. I, many years ago, tried to trace my family history. And that was long before the days of computers, where you had to do everything by hand on pieces of paper. and before digital photography. So when you have a film camera, you don't really take very many tombstone photos. If you're tracing your family, tombstones are important because they tell you when someone died, and if you know when they died, then you can maybe find an obituary which tells a lot about their life. Anyway, I got started that way, and then when digital cameras came out and they began having these websites for cemetery tombstone photos, I took photos of my family's tombstones, and if we could go to the first slide now, one of them,
Michael, you have a
you got to get the, hold on. Let's see. Just kind of, there we go.
Sorry. I thought that was.
This happens to be the tombstone of my great-great-grandmother, Bridget Walsh Kearney. She was born in Tipperary, Ireland, and died in 1878, and she's buried out in DeWitt. One thing that really kind of drives me crazy is in the lower part of the tombstone, and I'm sure the people in the back of the room can't see it at all, it tells where she's from in Tipperary, but I've never found a place by that name in Tipperary. Tipperary, of course, is the county. But anyway, this is one of the early ones, and she married my great-great-grandfather, James Kearney, at St. Anthony's Church in Davenport on July 22nd, 1845. And there's kind of a sad story associated not so much with her, but with her predecessor, because she was my great-great-grandfather's second wife. He married for the first time on October 5th, 1843, to a woman named Julia Martin in Philadelphia at a church that is still there, just across the street to the east of the former Wanamaker store. And you're probably not aware of the fact that first in May and then in July of 1844 there were some terrible anti-Catholic riots in Philadelphia. The Native American Party marched into the Irish neighborhood in Kensington and began denouncing the Irish, which they did not appreciate, and at the end of the day they burned a couple hundred Irish homes and 3 churches. And the Pennsylvania militia, under the command of General Cadwalader, was called out, and they ended up engaging the Native Americans with artillery and put all of Philadelphia, the metropolitan area, under martial law, which lasted for the better share of that year. And then they repeated the whole thing in July in the neighborhood which was then called Southwark, which is today called Queensgate, immediately to the south of Independence Hall. And I presume that for that reason they came to Davenport in 1844. And Julia gave birth to a son on September 26th that year and died on October 10th. And so my definition of heaven is where you get to meet all these people. And I've always had a very soft spot in my heart for Julia, this poor woman who's married October 5th, and the following October 10th she dies. And in 1844 they didn't have railroads connecting Philadelphia to Davenport, so the trip for her as a pregnant woman in those days must have been very arduous. So anyway, that, as I say, one tombstone can sometimes generate a lot of different thoughts and memories. If we could go to the next one. This is my great-great-grandfather, Owen McLaughlin, and he's buried here in Fulton, up on the hill in the Calvary Cemetery, and died, as you see, in 1872. He moved here from upstate New York with his wife and daughter, and I do not know what was the cause of his death, but nevertheless, this is a picture I took several years ago, and unfortunately, in the meantime, that tombstone is weathered quite a bit. So one of the benefits of taking pictures is you can sort of freeze what you have at that moment in time, and when it comes to something that's out in the weather, it rarely gets better. So if We can go to the next one. Next to him, obviously this is new, and guess who arranged to have this put in? His wife and daughter and son-in-law are all buried next to him, and also in the Calvary Cemetery here in Tombstone, in Fulton. Okay, then we go to the next one. These are the previous photo showed the tombstone of Andrew Lynch. This is Andrew's parents, my great-great-grandparents, Michael Lynch and his wife Bridget Fleming Lynch. They are the people who arrived in Clinton County in 1840. And poor Michael was a founding member of, well, the family were founding members of St. Arneas Parish up in Lyons. He helped construct their first church building. And the poor guy got cholera and died, as you can see, in 1851. And then his son, Michael, was in the Union Army during the siege of Vicksburg, and he contracted what may have been something like cholera. It was described as diarrhea, and died in August of 1863 in Jefferson Barracks outside of St. Louis, leaving a widow and child. And the child died, well, actually the child didn't live that long, and his widow remarried and died in 1882. Then we get to his mother. I know a lot about them because in about 1890 or so, there was a program for pensions for widows who had no means of support, who were connected with a soldier from the Civil War. And all of these affidavits were filed by people who knew them, mostly family members. And so I have an eyewitness description of Michael being lowered into his grave, for example, in connection with that. It was a wonderful resource. I might add that most of you have heard of Bulger's Hollow, north of Clinton. The area around Bulger's Hollow was the area where they all owned property. And Bulger married Michael and Bridget's daughter, my great-grandfather's sister. And he was at Vicksburg with his brother-in-law, Michael Jr., and one night had picket duty. And Bulger, it started to rain, and he didn't want the barrel of his gun to rust, so he cupped his left hand over the muzzle. And you know what the next panel in the cartoon will show. The gun went off, the bullet went through the palm of his hand, and again, this is all wonderfully documented in records. Went through the palm of his hand, and of course, at Vicksburg, neither side had any medical capability. So his hand and arm shriveled up. Poor guy lived till 1912. Went back to Elgin, which is where he was from originally, Kane County, where he died in 1912. But anyway, that's that side of the family. And so far, everything I've shown you has been the Irish side of the family, but in the next slide, oh, sorry, we're not done with the Irish yet. They didn't all stay in Clinton. There's another great-great-grandfather, James Crowley. You'll notice his tombstone says where he was born. I think that's a mistake. There's a town in Ireland called Bandon in County Cork. In County Kerry, there's a mountain called Brandon, and I'm pretty sure the Crowleys all seem to have come from the town of Bandon in County Cork.
Oh, so that's a mistake.
And he and his family moved from Clinton County to Fillmore County, Minnesota in 1854, where their one daughter was the first European female born in that county. And then after he died, his widow went to South Dakota and homesteaded a decade before South Dakota became a state. And for me, that part of the family is sort of the Little House on the Prairie, you know, and supposedly in Little House on the Prairie, they would move when they could hear the sound of their neighbor's axe. And that wouldn't possibly have been the case in South Dakota, because I've seen pictures of Hanson County, South Dakota from that time, and there's not a single tree or shrub in sight anywhere in the picture. But anyway, here again, I took this picture probably 25 or 30 years ago, and another relative from that side of the family has been there more recently, and it appears that that stone is completely crumbled.
Wow.
So this is it when it comes to documenting that side of the family. Now if we can go to the next one. I also have German ancestors, and some of you in Clinton, everyone in Clinton with the name either Duer or Weinbeck is related. And that's in Springdale Cemetery. And John Johann Weinbeck, my great-grandfather, came from Bavaria, and so naturally he was Catholic. His wife, Anna Duer, came from Schleswig-Holstein, poles apart in Germany. And of course in Schleswig-Holstein, almost everyone is Lutheran, and that was the case with them. So, and the other thing is, in Schleswig-Holstein they speak Platt, which is called Low German. And in Bavaria they speak a kind of German called Bayerisch, which is not so easy to understand when you speak Hochdeutsch or High German. The reason they got together is in 1877 she married a fellow who subsequently at some point disappeared. I don't know whether they got divorced, whether he died, whether he ran off, etc. But supposedly she answered an ad in the newspaper to become the upstairs maid for the Count Dornberg. The Turnen-Taxis family historically in Germany had the postal service in Germany, and Count Dornberg was his postmaster general in the town of Regensburg. And so she was the upstairs maid and he was the Kutscher, the teamster. He took care of the horses. And the story I have heard is one night he took the Count and Countess to the theater, and if you come out of Schloss Dornberg, the Dornberg residence, and turn left and go down perhaps a quarter of a mile, you get to the Theater in Regensburg, which is a wonderful building that, you know, here we would have long since torn down. It's about 300 years old, still used today, in perfect shape. And so normally, apparently, his plan was the Count and Countess would go to the theater, and on the side of the theater they had a beer garden. And on the other side, there was a Jesuit seminary, which is still there today. And he had a friend who was a seminarian, and apparently they had a beer together. Well, this was the 1880s, which in Germany is known as the Wilhelminenzeit, which would be the German equivalent of the Victorian age in England. And there were rules, if you will, and one of them was that clergy didn't go to beer gardens. And my great-grandfather screwed up pretty badly that night because he didn't realize that the play had been canceled. And so he had his beer, you know, in leisure, and when he thought enough time had passed for the play to be over, he got up, got the carriage, went around to pick up the Count and Countess, who were fuming mad, and fired him on the spot. And on the way back, the Count saw the seminarian in the beer garden and got him into a potload of trouble. Well, that didn't sit very well with my great-grandfather, so the next time he went to confession, he laid it all on the line, and that was the last he ever had to do with any church. So then he and his wife, Anna Duer, came directly from there to Clinton. They boarded the boat Westphalia in Hamburg on May 12th, 1885. They arrived in New York at Castle Clinton, which is now the Battery, which preceded Ellis Island, on May 25th, and got on the train and came directly to Clinton, where he worked as a car builder for the railroad for the rest of his life. And Anna raised all of her children at Zion Lutheran. And that worked out fine. And that included my grandmother. And my grandmother married my Irish Catholic grandfather, who was a Lynch. And but he was not very religious, so she had all of her children, including my mother, baptized at Zion Lutheran, enrolled them in Irving School, and they lived on 17th Avenue South, where the Gold Dome is now, and did the same thing her mother did. What's wrong with that? Well, the difference was her Irish Catholic mother-in-law, Sarah McLaughlin Lynch, lived on First Avenue, both in the 500 block, 17 blocks away. Gave her an unending ration of grief about the fact that her children are not being raised Catholic. So the story I hear is one day my grandmother had it up to here. She pulled all the kids out of Irving School, marched them up to St. Mary's, had them all rebaptized. My mother has 2 baptismal certificates, and enrolled them in St. Mary's School, and with typical German thoroughness and efficiency, and one day that was that. And that's the way it's been ever since. Anyway, we should probably move on from that. This is, as you see, Silke Jans Hardison. It's very hard to read, but the inscription on this tombstone, if you're up close enough to it, says that Silke was married to Thomas Hardison, and I don't know if you know Hardisons in the area, but this is that connection. And they were from Afta. Now, those of you in Clinton might know, Afta, which is a small town in Schleswig-Holstein, is a sister city of Clinton. And it's the city that Anadur came from, and Anadur's mother's maiden name was Jans. Silke Jans was the daughter of my great-grandmother's sister. And the point here is there's a German section of Springdale. Back in the day, in the 19th century, various groups had their own cemeteries, of course. And in this case, the Germans decided rather than having a German cemetery per se, they had a section at Springdale, and that's where they're buried. And that kind of gets to the business of the inscriptions here. This is an inscription in German because Silke Jans, and then the next line says Frau von, the wife of, etc. So why don't we go on to the next one. We also have, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Sardam tombstones here in Fulton, but David Joyce was one of the lumber barons who came to Clinton in the mid-1850s. And he and his wife, Elizabeth Thomas, only had one child, a son, William Thomas, who married Clotilda Gage from Lyons. And they had 2 sons, and that whole line died out. So there are no living survivors of David Joyce, the lumber baron. Having said that, his sister Pamela married a man named Sylvester Sardam, and Sylvester worked with the Joyces and ran their operation here in Fulton. And that's the Sardams who are there. So the only connection today, and there are living descendants of the Sardams out on the West Coast. I've made contact with them. But they're buried here. It's the southwest corner of the Fulton City Cemetery. Okay. This is an example, this just talking about the inscriptions on tombstones. This is a Marie Hansen who's buried, I believe, at Center Grove Township Cemetery outside of Goose Lake. But you'll notice it says geboren, which is the German word for born, in Breiholz. Breiholz is a town in Germany just outside of Rendsburg, which is in Schleswig-Holstein. Let's see here. We'll put this around like this so I'm speaking into the microphone. But this tells where she was born, gives her exact date of birth and her exact date of death. And I think it's the next one that I have. I get into that, yes. Go to the next one. This shows this a little better. Here's another. Actually, it says here, born in Kiel, and the name to me looks Swedish, but people moved around there. And the GEB is the abbreviation for geboren, meaning born. The GEST is the abbreviation for gestorben, meaning died. And this his wife, see it has Carolyn Svensson, geborene Rief. She would be the German side, because that name is common in that part of Germany. And so she was born in Rief in 1841, it looks like, and she died in 1920. Go ahead. This is sort of interesting. You know, a lot of people think it's crazy. I have photographed and posted something like 67,000 burials. And someone told me the other day they were talking about this presentation, and they said, oh my God, I hope he doesn't show 67,000 pictures. No. But one that was particularly rewarding for me this is a Paul Ingerson, and I don't know if you know the name Ingerson, but there are Ingersons that have lived, quite a few here in the county. Most of them are buried either in Center Grove Cemetery or Oakland. But there's one in Rossiter. This is the only one named Ingerson in Rossiter, which is a small cemetery just south of Charlotte, across the road from the old county home. And I got an email from a woman who lives outside of Hanover, Germany, saying, thank you, thank you. That is the brother of my great-grandfather. And she would never have found it if she hadn't found it on that website. And then we go to this one, Andrew Anderson. And I'm thinking he's probably Swedish since he spells his name S-O-N. But also, look at the inscription here. You know, I don't know Swedish, but at the beginning it says, looks like F-O-O-D, the 24th of July, 1880. I assume in Swedish, F-O-O-D means born. And then down at the bottom, D-O-D-D. I assume D-O-D is the way you say died in Swedish, in 1892, so he was only 12 years old. Okay, now, you know, we can't be too ethnocentric here. This is a tombstone that popped up relatively recently in Springdale, and when I drove by it, I did a double take. Of course, it's all Chinese, and only Chinese. They do have dates that are in our form, but otherwise it's Chinese. And so I thought, well, how am I going to put this up on the website? Because you enter it by the name of the person. And so then it dawned on me, well, gee whiz, it's easy to find out what this says. I went to the China Garden restaurant, which is on 3rd Street and 6th Avenue. And I sat there for a minute, and the first woman who came out that looked something like a Chinese woman to me, I said, can you read Chinese? And she said, oh, yes. And so I said, and I had printed this out, and I said, can you tell me what this says? I said, oh, yes. And so those are the two people who are buried there. And actually, they're not both buried. Only one is buried there. The one in red. It must be the Chinese custom on a tombstone. When they die and they're buried, they color the letters red. And the one on the right, which is Mr. Gong Kai Lin, is apparently still living. And so his is, and you'll notice there's no death date for him. And then they have this apparently custom of when they visit the grave, they put play money on the grave. Yeah, those were not, I checked, they were not. They're not real currency up there, but, and it's my understanding that this family is connected with the ownership of the China Garden and China One restaurants. So, anyway, I got a kick out of that. Okay, we talked earlier about lumber barons, and of course another lumber baron was W.J. Young. And of course, one thing people would do when they had serious money, it was instead of being buried in the ground, they'd build a fancy mausoleum, which is very expensive. And of course in Springdale they have more than a half a dozen of them for W.J. Young, Chauncey Lamb, the Curtises, the Lees, a bunch of people. There's one in St. Mary's Cemetery, there's one in Oakland Cemetery, etc. But why don't we go to the next one here? Let's see if this works. Okay, see now, we're really high tech here. We have a video with this as well. And so, I don't know how many of you know Bob Evans, the former publisher of the Clinton Herald. Well, he was married to Beth Hancock, and Beth Hancock's grandmother, her father's mother, was a Young. And so they have, actually Beth, Court and Betty Hancock, by design, were not buried there. They were buried at Clinton Lawn. But Bob has the key, and he asked me once if I wanted to take a trip. Got a little technical problem here. The image is broken up, but at least it's working. The first couple of times we tried to do this, I couldn't get the movie part to work at all.
Oh, here's
But
my friend.
Bob, in a minute here, will take me in for the inside. I don't know how many of you have ever been on the inside of a private mausoleum before. And just before Bob arrives, right next to them are the graves of the Cohens. And the Cohen family was the founder of Clinton National Bank, which was ultimately acquired by the W.J. Young estate. And so it's interesting that they would be buried adjacent to each other. W.F. Cohen was one of the people who promoted the idea of the Lincoln Highway. There's a little monument or memorial to him. These are the Cohen graves. Right at the corner of Highway 67 and Highway 30, across from McElhaney is where the Quickstar is. And unfortunately, the Cohens, two of them, died of their own hand. So they apparently had some unresolved issues. But, and it was Cohen's property, Cohen pasture, that was acquired by the school district in 1919 to build what is now Clinton High School. It was originally 60 acres, and they probably regret the fact that they didn't keep it, because now they don't have any place for the students to park. Except in front of the neighbors' houses, which is kind of a neighborhood issue. Anyway, I apologize for this. The original that I have is nice and clear and sharp and works fine.
So goes in or out?
There we go, see? Get a swimmer involved.
So it swings in, the doors? Yeah?
No, it swings out.
Oh, it swings out.
One of the things that's interesting is apparently W.J. Young, he builds this mausoleum, and normally in a mausoleum all the coffins are up in the air. W.J. Young apparently is in the ground. He's got the
So
mausoleum
it's
over
just
him.
an...
And then the only other one that is marked in there is Dr. Wilson, who married one of W.J. Young's daughters and died young. In fact, married, well, the Youngs, as you know, were instrumental in establishing the YMCA in Clinton, and subsequently, there, we click that again. No, let's see here.
So I need to advance.
Let's see here.
You go down to the arrow. That's backwards, so.
Well, let me go
Forward arrow would be over.
there we go.
There we go.
This is, I think, my favorite monument of all the monuments that I've seen. This is out in Clinton Lawn Cemetery, and this woman's children must have had a great sense of humor. There's another one out there that is more common. They have one that's the hypochondriac's tombstone. The inscription there said, "I told you I was sick." But I've seen that elsewhere. But this is the only one I've seen like that. And I have a cousin who's in the banking business here locally, and I made a point of giving him a copy of that. He got a big kick out of it. Now, here's another one that's kind of interesting. They have their whole family tree carved on the back of the monument. This is the Schmidt and Herkelman family, and this is in Pleasant Hill Cemetery, just northeast of Delmer. But it's the only one I've ever seen like that. It's kind of an interesting idea. I mean, that's in granite. That'll be there for a while. Okay. Now, when you get involved in cemeteries, I think Boot Hill in Tombstone, Arizona has got to be one of the more interesting ones. I have a cousin who had a daughter who lived there in Tombstone for a long time. And in fact, his wife was the family that's lived in Tombstone continuously longer than any other family, the De Veres. And one of his wife's relatives runs this cemetery. So naturally, they had a daughter that got married, and I went to the wedding, and when I was there, I visited the tombstone, and you know, every marker in the tombstone says shot, killed, hung, and then there are some that say shot by mistake or hung by mistake. And out of all the burials in the tombs in the cemetery, there's one that says died a natural death. And as you can see, there's one guy named Kearney, Thomas Kearney, and as a matter of fact, the brother of my cousin who lived there is Thomas Kearney, but as far as I can tell, and I think I've traced every Kearney who is descended from my Kearney immigrant ancestor, we're not connected. And the records I can find say he was killed in an explosion, but what it doesn't say is whether the explosion was deliberate or accidental. Anyway, let's, and I'll point out two other things. The next to the last line, somebody's tombstone says, as you pass by, remember that as you are, so once was I, and as I am, you soon will be. Remember me. And then the marker at the bottom, here lies Lester Moore. Took 2 slugs from a 44. No less, no more. Now here's another little video. And this is the real thing. Looks like we got the breakup problem.
Yeah, it's the
I
pixel.
was tempted just to use my original, and I don't know whether... why walk around half dead when we can bury you for only $22? Tombstone Undertakers. They'll sell you a lot for $12. And they have the finest carriage in all of Arizona. Let's see. If this is going to be pixelated like this, I think maybe the best thing to do is to go on. I mentioned the Hardisons here. This is back in Afta, which is where the Hardisons originated. And this is one of the Hardisons who's buried there. Just to kind of illustrate the connections, I know a fellow who, as it happens, is an 8th cousin, Frank Hardison, who lives outside of Kiel. And he's done some tracing of his family, and most of the Hardisons now are not in Germany, they're in the United States. Go ahead. And you'll notice they have the same Geboren and Gestorben. Donaustauf is the town my great-grandfather came from down in Bavaria, and this is the cemetery there at the church. And you'll notice that their cemeteries are a lot more crowded than ours. Land, of course, is at a premium. Germany has 80 million people in a space a little bit bigger than Illinois and Indiana put together. And when you don't buy your lot, you rent it. And so you'll have a lease for either 20 or 30 years, and we have native German here who can support this. When your lease runs out, if you don't renew your lease, those bones come out, somebody else goes in. And
No less, no more.
go ahead. We'll go to the next one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And this also is in, I mentioned my Weinbecks. Well, here's, this is Jacob Weinbeck, who was a nephew of my great-grandfather. And one other thing I'll point out is here, you know, in the German tombstones we've seen before, they have geboren, or G-E-B, for birth, and gestorben, or G-E-S-T, for death. The convention in Germany is you have an asterisk meaning born and a cross meaning died. So if you see a German tombstone with those on it, that's what that means. So go ahead. Now, in the interest of, what shall I say, balance, I'm divorced, and frankly in a very unpleasant divorce, but my former wife's family came, on her paternal line, came from a town called Eschi in Switzerland. It's right up above Lake Thun. And of course I've been there, and this is her name was Von Kanel, and that's Von Kanel in that particular cemetery. Now, as I say, certainly if you spend any time in a cemetery and look around, remember that great philosopher from St. Louis, Yogi Berra, said, you can see a lot by looking. If you go in a cemetery, you know, they have certain character, and sometimes the character that's obvious is the ethnic origin of the people who are in the cemetery. And in other cases, it's just the name itself. So let's go to the next one here. For example, Jane, who did you have a date with last night? Mr. Dahl. If that's the case, why are you still dating him? Or, this job requires great attention to detail, Mr. or Schlappy. Yeah, that's a pretty well-known family in Clinton. But that's the name. And then we have another one. Yes. Tell me about, I had children who were junior high school students, and particularly boys in junior high school seem to be endlessly fascinated with elimination functions. And of course that's a family that seems to be from the Elvira area. And,
I know you. I've heard of you.
pretty well known, yeah. Well, John is only one of many. They have a big Crapson monument out there too. Anyway, go ahead.
There are a couple of people that
This was on Channel 6.
history of this town.
And Mike Kearney has photographed all of their graves. So far, he has taken 66,000 pictures. His goal, to photograph every marker in Clinton County.
To be precise, I photographed every marker. Some markers have one name on them, some have two.
The project started about 9 years ago when Kearney was researching his family history.
If you're trying to find the history of a family, of course a good way to do it is through the obituary, but you don't know what date to look for unless you can find it in the records of the cemetery.
Then in 2005, when Clinton was celebrating his sesquicentennial, the Historical Society decided to take pictures of all the gravestones as a part of the larger Iowa Gravestones website. Since Kearney had a head start, he became the project leader.
I've had emails from all over the country with people saying, thank you, I found my great grandmother or grandfather.
He's photographed the gravestones of people he personally knew.
Howard was the most successful swimming coach in the state of Iowa. He produced a number of All-Americans and 11 state championships.
Others who were a part of the nation's history.
The Civil War veterans, of course, are especially interesting because there you had units that all came from one place, and often they were buried together.
And he's found a few who have a sense of humor.
Aha! Catherine Moore, here we are, right here. I can't be overdrawn. I still have checks. I think this is the wittiest one that I've seen in Clinton County.
Kearney doesn't have plans to stop photographing gravestones anytime soon. He's still searching for one in particular, the one that motivated him to start the project.
And the really sad thing, after doing all this, I've mentioned my great-great-grandfather, James Kearney. I've never found a marker, or the marker deteriorated and was discarded.
In Clinton, Erica Cervantes, KWQC HD News.
So on that note, I was told that I had to get everybody out of here inside of an hour, so does anybody have any questions or?
You just talked 40 minutes because we started late.
Oh, right. Actually, if you're interested, I do have the jump drive here with the actual videos. If we want to play the videos, we can try those from the jump drive.
Oh, with the extra, yeah. While you're talking, you want
I
to
have one
say.
question, Mike. What
Yeah.
brought those original relatives to Clinton or to this part of the country?
Well, I think I've given you a
I think
pretty
was
good
the first
idea about
ones.
what brought the Germans here. Yeah. He screwed up, got fired, and his wife's family apparently had already made connections in Clinton, so they had a
Okay.
place to go and they came here.
You mentioned the ones that, did they go to St. Louis and one of those areas?
Well, the Lynch side of my family, and looking through probate records, I have a letter that was written in 1850 from one member of the family to the other, encouraging them to come here, and it was better here than in St. Louis. They clearly came up the river from New Orleans because they, in the probate records, there were expenses of the trip that were accounted for. But let's see
Do you
here.
want to show that blue hill?
Yeah, click on Blue Hill.
Which one though? Is it this one?
No,
Or down here?
try that one. Let's see if this is any better, I hope. But as far as the Irish are concerned, I think they came here because, you know, conditions in Ireland were dreadful at that time, and they could get land here. And they all came over, whether they knew a thing about farming or not, they came over here, got land, and
They came directly here, they didn't stop at, like, a lot of them stopped at Chicago or stayed
well,
in
it
New
depends
York
which
a
branch
while.
of the family you're talking
Okay.
about. You know, I mentioned that James Kearney was in Philadelphia until the riots occurred in Philadelphia. Why did he come to Iowa? Well, I know the BVMs, which is an order of nuns, transferred their headquarters from Philadelphia to Dubuque in 1843, a year before James came to Davenport. But other than that, I don't know why he went to Davenport as opposed to anywhere else in the country. You know, in the case of, I have another set of great-grandparents, Cornelius Boyle and his wife Catherine Long. They came in about 1844, or no, sorry, in 1850 exactly, from Boston to DeWitt. And the archdiocesan newspaper in Boston is the Boston Pilot. And Notre Dame was established in 1843, and they hired a fellow named Gillum, I think his name was, to recruit students from all over the Midwest. Because, you know, in 1843, South Bend, Indiana was a pretty godforsaken place. And in May of 1850, he had an article in the Boston, a sideline for him was to write articles about places suitable for Irish settlement.
Oh,
Because, you know, the Irish in the port cities were not treated very well in those days. And he had an article about DeWitt, Iowa. And you should read it. It would make you want to move to DeWitt yourself. And bingo, next thing you know, Cornelius and Catherine are in DeWitt. And he initially had a farm north of town.
Is Beth Hancock still in the area if she's living? Is
She's
still
out
lives
at
here?
Valley Oaks.
Oh, okay.
And do you go back and forth to Europe regularly, or?
Well, I did my military service in Germany in 1964 through, well, I got an overseas out in 66, and then I studied there for a while and worked for a German company for a while before I came back. And since that time, I've gone back frequently. I was last there 2 years ago. In fact, I visited the former wife and daughter and grandchildren of my former commanding officer from the Army when I was there. And I may go back and visit them again in March. And I have located a third cousin on the Weinbeck side of the family who lives outside of Leipzig. And of course others. Donaustauf is the town where my great-grandfather was born. And I've, in fact, a third cousin lives in the house where my great-grandfather was born. A property that's been in the family at least since 1800.
Where do you go to look for information when you're there? Or do you do this online first and then you
I
go?
pretty much do stuff from here.
From here?
Yeah, I haven't really gone over there to extensively try and research anything there. I mean, certainly, for example, when I was in Donaustauf, I took a picture of the graveyard there, but I'd already researched that enough. In the case of Schleswig-Holstein, I kind of got started with this when I was in about 7th grade or something. We were asked to write a paper describing ourselves in terms of our ancestral heritage. And we were given a paper, a sheet, which had some of the most horrible stereotypes you could imagine for all kinds of ethnic groups. You know, the Germans were technical, the Irish were fun-loving, blacks had a sense of rhythm, and something that would be entirely unacceptable today. But that's how we started. So I went to my grandmother and put together, you know, going back to my great-great-grandparents, because of course my grandparents knew who their grandparents were. And then when I was over there in the Army, I thought, well, I know the town that my great-grandmother came from and the town my great-grandfather came from, so let's go there. But of course they'd left 100 and some odd years before. Nobody knew anything about them, and I didn't know where to look. And in 1973, I think, two or three, Business Week in the back always has some yellow sheet pages where they discuss activities that people engage in, hobbies and so forth. And they had an article that said an increasing number of people are tracing their family history. And they made reference to a book which described how to do it. I thought, gee, you know, I think I'm as smart as the guy next door. So I ordered the book, bought the book, followed it, and then it says start from where you are and go toward what you don't know. So I learned how to speak and read and write German, so I wrote a nice little letter in German to the church in Afta and said, do you have a baptismal record for Anna Dur, my great-grandmother? A couple months later, back in the mail comes Auszug aus der Taufregister, an excerpt from the baptismal record. And it not only gave her and her date of birth, which I already knew, but it gave the names of her parents, the names of her godparents, the profession of all the men, and that sunk the hook. So then I immediately wrote back and I said, do you have a marriage record for the parents? A couple months later, back that comes. And so that's what sort of got me started.
I did mine by email, it went real fast.
Well, see, this was before Al Gore had invented the internet.
But it wasn't free, I had to pay 15 euros.
Well, see, I got mine for free, but I wrote by hand. But anyway, this is Boot Hill Cemetery in Tombstone. And it's still a pretty godforsaken place. I mean, I would hate to be hung by mistake there.
Or even on purpose.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So either a resource would be through a church or the courthouse then? Would that be your best?
Well, typically, see, one thing to keep in mind is that civil records were not kept until a certain period of time. In continental Europe, most places did not keep civil records of birth, marriage, death until 1860 or later. So your only source would be the church, because of course the church did keep, at least in the Christian church, you know, baptism was the first time you'd really generate a record. They didn't have public health in those days, so there was no reason for the government to be concerned about someone having a baby. And of course, marriage was a church ceremony, so they'd keep a record of that, and usually death, the burial, the funeral, would generate a record. So that's a good source. And then, of course, another source, oh, sorry, thought I was speaking loudly enough so everyone could hear. But another source is probate records, things like that. Wonderful documents can be found in a probate file. As I mentioned, I have a letter in the probate file for my Lynches that's at the court. I don't have it, it's at the courthouse, but it describes how much better it is to settle in Lyons than in St. Louis. Question?
Family Bibles also.
Bibles, yes, unfortunately, that's another interesting story. I always thought Bibles were a wonderful source of information, so I talked to all my cousins on both sides of the family, and I could never locate a family Bible. And I thought, I come from a pretty religious family, but I guess they were also, as soon as they didn't need something, they'd throw it out. And one reason I started going back is I thought, well, maybe the family Bible was in the possession of a second cousin rather than a first cousin. So then I went to the great-grandparent level and all of their descendants, still no Bible. Then I went to the great-great-grandparent level. I never did find a family Bible that was historic. But for people that have one, it is a wonderful contemporaneous record of birth, marriage, death, etc.
Do you also have pictures of the people?
In some cases, when I can find them, I have pictures. I have one, the great-great-grandmother who never left Bavaria. I have a picture of her, and I have a picture of a great-grandmother who lived down by the Wapsie, between DeWitt and Long Grove. But generally, I don't have pictures for people earlier than the great-grandparent generation. I have pictures of them, of course.
No cameras then.
Well, and of course, people that had more money had portraits and pictures and so forth. But then again, I remember my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, had a box full of family pictures. And I saw that. And after she died, somebody decided, well, time to clean up. Out they went. And of course, the other thing that's frustrating with pictures, and people never seem to learn this lesson, is that on the back of each picture you should mark who it is. Because what good does it do to have a picture of someone you've never met and you don't know who it is?
That's right.
And in the best of all worlds, you not only identify who it is, but when it was taken and if it's at an occasion, what the occasion was.
I got all the old pictures.
But
Question in the back.
oh, sorry.
Do you know where the Spanish American
great-grandmother.
soldier buried in
My
the
grandmother.
cemetery by the Eagle Point?
The cemetery, you mean in Oakland?
Is that what it's called?
Yeah, there are 3 cemeteries up by Eagle Point. As you're driving to Eagle Point, the first one on your left is what they originally called Calvary. It's Calvary St. Arneas, which is a Catholic cemetery, mainly Irish. And then straight ahead, when you walk in, and there's the little chapel on your right, which incidentally was built by the Joyces. The Joyces helped buy some of the land to expand that cemetery. That's Oakland. And then on the west side of Highway 67 is St. Boniface, which is German Catholic originally. And those are the main cemeteries up there.
Do you know where that Spanish American soldier was buried?
They have a military section in Oakland. How to describe how to get there. If you drive into Oakland, it's sort of to your left and back. And frankly, I don't remember if those are more Civil War or Spanish-American War. And one of the things that's kind of funny is next to my German great-grandfather's marker, John Weinbeck, who was born in February 1855, there's a Spanish-American War marker, and I can't imagine that he had anything at all to do with the Spanish-American War. if you're born in 1855, he would have been in his mid-40s at the time of that war. And I can't imagine him charging up San Juan Hill with Teddy. But, because of that, I've tried to make some inquiries as to whether anybody had any records of people from this area who served in this Spanish-American War, and I haven't been successful in finding any.
I just read in the paper one time that, I don't know if it was Everett Street or whoever said it.
Well, Ebb Street did some great things that way. Yeah. Madam?
Did you find any Irish information in Ireland?
You know, that's very frustrating. On the German side, I've traced every single branch of the family back to the early 1600s. The Germans take very good records. The Irish seem to have been, well, the problem, of course, in Ireland is the Troubles. First of all, when the Cromwells conquered Ireland, they imposed the penal laws, which made it illegal for a papist, meaning a Catholic, to be educated, to own a horse worth more than 5 pounds, to inherit property, etc. And so in the space of a generation or two, the Irish went from the most literate people in Europe to the least literate. And that had its consequences in terms of record keeping, I think. There's been a somewhat casual attitude, I think, about that there. And even though I've looked high and low, I've never found a document in Ireland that I could definitely link to any one of my Irish ancestors who came here. Again, my definition of heaven is where you get to meet all these people and ask them those questions. So, any other? Yes?
Is there any way you can tell me that I could find the name of the ship that my great-grandparents or grandparents came over on?
There are a couple of ways you could go to try and find that out. Where did your ancestors board the ship, do you know?
I assume Holland.
So, you know, I could tell you a lot about German and Irish, not so much about Holland, although I do have one great-great-grandfather who was Flemish, and I don't know how he got here, but he came from West Flanders, so he would have spoken the language at least. In the case of my German immigrant ancestors, they maintain a registry in Hamburg of ship departures, and that is online now. And so, I know, as I mentioned in the talk, my great-grandparents from Germany came over here. They boarded on the 12th of May, 1885. They arrived in New York on the 25th of May. They traveled on the ship Westphalia, and when I was involved in researching this, I linked up with a gal in Hamburg. This was before the information was available online. She researched and sent me the information about the ship, and beyond that, she went to the Hapag-Lloyd, which was the ultimate surviving corporation, and got the whole history of the ship. I know when it was built, I know when it was sold, when it changed its name, how big it was, you know, how many decks it had, how wide, deep, etc., and when it was finally scrapped. And I have a picture of the ship. That's just wonderful. Now on this end, of course, you have the arrival records. So if you have a good idea when that person arrived, then you could try and locate that. And of course, a key date is 1892 because it was in 1892 that Ellis Island opened up and they had more extensive records. And you tended to have more people arrive there. Prior to that, you know, my great-grandfather Kearney arrived in Philadelphia. And I haven't even tried to find an arrival record for him.
What would be the website to check out?
Oh dear. Generally, your best bet to start, I would say, would be to go on the web to rootsweb.com and then look for the choices there. You know, you'll get a page that'll give you all kinds. Now, one thing that's just happened in the last few months, one great tool that existed up until a few months ago was the Social Security Death Index. And that was available on RootsWeb, and usually within a matter of a couple of months after someone died, their information would pop up. And that would give you their name, their date of birth, and date of death, and where they received their last benefit, and their Social Security number. And I guess people were worried that identity theft, now I don't know how you could possibly have a problem if someone's deceased and someone else uses their Social Security number. You know, when you die, your privacy is pretty well over. But that's much less accessible. I think you can still get that on Ancestry.com. And the library can, if you go to, you know, Clinton Library at least, I assume maybe Fulton as well. Yes? No?
No.
No, okay. Well then, you have the option in Clinton, you go to the library and they have Ancestry.com on the downstairs in the roots cellar, and go to Ancestry and type in the name, and you'd be surprised what'll pop up.
FamilySearch.org is another one that's the church, the Mormon Church.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
That's good record.
And that's an interesting project. They took inmates from the Utah prison system and had them transcribing census reports of 1850 up through 1920 or 30, I can't remember when. 30 is the last one that's been released. Actually, April of this year, the 1940 census will be released. So some of us will be able to see our own name in the census next April. But they keep the census confidential for 72 years.
The census are an interesting way. I've been doing quite a bit of research, and I don't know who actually wrote the information down. It's always in the same handwriting, but you see an actual picture of the census. And in like the 1860, it will say there was a son who was 9 years old. 10 years later, he's 22. So
They were a little casual about that at times, depending on who was hired by the Census Department to do that part of town or that section of the countryside. I've seen that as well. There can be age and name spelling differences.
girl versus boy.
Well, I've never encountered that. There's never been any gender confusion on the records that I've looked at, but I suppose it's possible. Because, let's face it, the census taker's at the door. She's talking to someone, she or he is talking to whoever answers the door, and that person gives the information for the family. And there are some names that are a little ambiguous. You know, some names can be a man's name or a woman's name.
If the accents were hard to understand too, if they didn't catch the name.
Oh, absolutely. You know, you have the first generation who were Swedes, Danes, Irish. You know, even for someone who's not Irish, the way the Irish talk can be a little confusing at times. Madam?
Sometimes if nobody was home, they would ask information from neighbors, I've read. That could be
I imagine that's how they got through the day, yeah. And the neighbor might not know it. Of course, the neighbor might be a different ethnic group too, so that can lead to some confusion. Well, I know a number of people said they had to leave, so I'm feeling guilty about keeping it too long here.
Thank you.